All right, well, good morning. Welcome to the irrigation session discussing peanut irrigation. The credits are in the back, CU, CCA credits and all that. So if you make sure you fill that out before you leave. So we've got two different talks today. I'm going to be discussing overhead management for peanut irrigation, and not what's on the program, but Wilkes is going to be discussing what's on the program. He's not the speaker that's listed. He's going to be discussing pro management irrigation for peanuts. So what we kind of look at when I'm going to show some cost numbers in here in just a few minutes, and what we look at out of Georgia, I've worked with our ag economists to develop some of our average irrigation costs here. And right now we're sitting after 2016 at about $7.50 per acre inch. What that is a 50-50 comparison of $6 per acre inch for electric and $9 per acre inch for diesel. So that's compiled over the entire year. And so to put that in perspective on where we're at, if you're irrigating about 1,000 acres of land at about 10 inches of irrigation over that year, that's going to cost about $75,000 in just energy costs. This is out of a production guide and our peanut update at Georgia. So again, it's going to be probably a little bit different. We're here in the Mid-South, but it gives you an idea kind of where we stand. If we look at peanut water requirements, total throughout the year is 23 inches of water. That's from when we put that crop into the ground until we harvest it. And about 18 inches of the 23, or 78% of that water, is needed from weeks 10 to 17. So we've got a 7-week kind of critical period in there when we hit peak water use on the crop that we need to make sure we keep water to them, and we're also allocating most of that water at that time to them. So where we get that number from, that data from that water use curve, is basically here. We're looking at historic evapotranspiration. Now this is for an entire year, and I just want to show you some historical data, and then we're going to look at some of the data that I've collected, some of the irrigation we're looking at, to let you kind of think about what's going on. So this is evapotranspiration in inches per day from Tifton for 2016, and then it's versus the 5 and 10 year average. So the 5-year average is the orange line, the 10-year average is the black line, and that blue line is the 2016 data. So here's another site just up the road. This is Unadilla. So basically what we're seeing is a little bit higher highs, a little bit lower lows than the average when we start looking at both Tifton and Unadilla, these two sites. The purpose behind talking about this, if we go back to that peanut water use curve, if we're following just that water use curve there, we see that in 2016 in both Tifton and Unadilla, we've had much higher than average ET, especially during the production season. You see kind of mid or peak water use here showing up. We're seeing we're a lot higher than our historical average on our ET. So what that means is if we're following just that checkbook method, we have a very good chance to get behind on our irrigation applications at that time we see that high ET. So let's look at the rain events. Same thing, orange and black are my long-term averages. The blue are my 2016 events. And so the first thing that you kind of notice when you start looking at this graph for Tifton is that in our averages we have a lot of lower events, smaller events throughout the year, and in Tifton we had a lot of large-scale events that came through. So it's going to help explain some of the data I'm going to show. Same thing in Unadilla. So we're about 100 miles apart from these two sites, but we see kind of a very similar thing. When we get kind of the summertime, we see real large intensity events, but they're really spread out. We don't see very many small events like we do on the average. So I kind of compiled the data from the mass survey that they have out there. They have it for every state, so if you're interested in seeing kind of where it stands for the state that you're in. This was from 2013. I think the survey will come out again in another year or two. But when it came out, basically they asked what the irrigation scheduling methods were used in the state. And so I picked out the most popular ones on this, averaged them by certain areas, and then compiled them. So look at the entire U.S., we've got about 80% of people irrigating based on visible stress. Whereas in Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, that number is closer to about 90%. So, we have guys that are losing yield potential due to waiting until they see visible stress on the crop. Fill of the soil is around 40% on average all the way across the board. And so my thing with fill of the soil when I start looking at it is I can go out and I can tell when the soil's very saturated and I can tell when the soil's dry. But when we start fine-tuning irrigation, it's really hard to tell if we're just filling that soil where we're at, where we need to be. We can tell, okay, there's moisture in the soil, but is that moisture ample? And so I think we need to really start getting away from fill of the soil and start getting into more using some of the sensors. So we see our adoption rate of sensors is relatively low. A little bit higher in Florida and Georgia than Alabama, but nothing significant. We look at scheduling services or weather reports. Same way, we're very, very low there. So again, nobody's really adopting those methods yet. Look at a calendar schedule, that's a little bit higher. Inevitably, in every room that I talk to on the calendar schedule, guys always say that they can't really do the soil moisture sensors or scheduling services or any of that because they have some sort of limiting factor. Basically, they're coming back and they're running their irrigation system. They're running multiple irrigation systems off of one pump in a lot of cases, so meaning they have a big conflict there. And so I encourage them to step back and look at a broader calendar schedule at that point. And what I mean by that is this time of year we know what crops that we're about to plant, so let's not put competing crops under the same competing system. I've saw a couple of cases of that in Georgia where we've had some vegetable crops and fruit crops running drip, also competing with corn on overhead irrigation off of one system. And the guys basically, if you sat down and did the engineering calculations to meet his water demand, he needed about a 36-hour day, right? So he would never be able to keep up. He's had a full deficiency the entire year, and it's very evident when you start looking at those high-value crops such as the fruits and vegetables out there. And so he just basically either needed another water supplier, needs to back off on some of what he's doing. And what I also say is, if all else fails, do what 2% of the nation or 6% is doing, and just irrigate when your neighbor irrigates, right? And that's the best method. We see it moving up down we start seeing guys do certain operations, we assume that they're right. So in this case, it's not what we really need to be doing. So let's talk about 3 years worth of trials that I have here. What time do we end? 11, so I need to quit. Okay. I'm going to talk about 3 years of trials that are different in their dynamics and produce different results, which is good in a way, and sort of showing different methods and different results for our different scheduling methods or where we need to home in on that. So of course I always like to put a dry land check in there, and if you look at the bottom, basically these peanuts were planted in mid to late May, dug in October, harvested middle of October, and we only received about 12 inches of rainfall in this particular year. What's really critical and important for me to point out here is that my dry land yield in this year was basically 0. This was actually, I should have put the additional harvest down here. These weren't harvested until about a month later. We waited almost till frost to try to get any pods to set on those peanuts. The UGA SSA, or a smart sensor array as we call it, what we've done is we've integrated watermark sensors into a probe, and I've developed a weighted average spreadsheet of about 40 to 50 kilopascal range that I trigger irrigation in. So what I should note, and you'll see it in a second, that each time we trigger irrigation, except on the checkbook method, we trigger a 3/4 inch event at this particular site, just because that's what our soil infiltration rate can manage. So I've tested smart crop sensors there too. So if we look at those, they apply about 6 inches of irrigation. UGA Easy Pan is basically an evaporation pan that you set out in the field. Nothing special about it. It has a toilet bowl float in it, catches the water that you receive from irrigation rainfall and evaporates out and simulates the crop canopy. Checkbook, of course, you saw that in the graph, the water use curve earlier, and that's what we follow. And then UF Peanut Farm is an online scheduling service that was developed at the University of Florida and that we've been working to refine. And so it basically downloads the local weather station data and uses an adjusted growing degree model to estimate peanut maturity and water use. So you can see by your yields, and the story that I'm not telling here is I've got 4 varieties averaged into each one of these. So there are certain varieties that perform much better than other ones, but we see that the sensor method basically is performing the best in this case with the lower application of water. When we look compared to the checkbook method, we have a really, really low, or about 1,000 pounds lower on yield, but we've added an additional 5 inches of water to that, suggesting that we are overwatering that crop. So I like to throw profitability numbers on this. You can go and hit the other one if you like. And the reason I do it the non-economic way, I work with one of my economists, and if we've got time, I've got some data at the end that I can show, we can look at from a different perspective. But what I've done is I took the yearly compiled average of electric irrigation pumping cost, diesel pumping cost, yield of my crop, and then my profit at the average price for peanuts that particular year in Georgia. And so this is strictly just a profit is what I've calculated here. And so you can look at the profit, and then you can pull production costs off of that and get an estimation of where you would stand. And so in this case, the sensor was by far the most profitable. And what I like to point out, independent You do see a very large separation when we see such a separation in the cost of diesel and electric in this case. So between the two, so it does promote the, the adoption of another energy source such as electric, or makes you consider that, and you see the difference in profitability. But I also want to point out that if we look at the checkbook, where we're profited about $950 per acre versus approximately $1,200 per acre in this case, we're starting to see that it's pretty easy to be able to afford sensors such as this, right? So that's one of our hindrances, is the cost of putting sensors in. And so if we properly manage this irrigation, we see that we can make returns on that. So, in that year, just to start looking at what's going on and some timings of irrigations and stuff, I basically have graphed rainfall here at the bottom. You can see the amount throughout the peanut growing season, so from May 20th to about October 12th here. Graph my irrigation triggers up top. And the reason I've done that, again, each one of these events is 3/4 of an inch of an event that I'll graph there, is we were trying to determine what the problem with peanut farm was. So where was it missing on timing, where were we at in the particular crop growth year. And what we see, if I go through, we had ample rainfall early in the season. So from about late May until about mid to late June, you see we had no irrigation triggered. If we come back and look from about July 1st until about September in this particular year, all of these rainfall events are, these are basically at a 1/4 inch. There's my 1/4 inch line there. I did have one here near 3/4 of an inch later. So if you go for about 2 months, or you go for, well, in this case, you go for about 2 weeks, almost 3 weeks, and you get a 1/4 inch event right at a 1/4 inch, does that really do anything for my irrigation management? My point is, right, that's barely settling the dust on the fields. And so, whereas we look at my sensor-based methods, my evaporation-based method, and of course my checkbook method that's water and independent of that, we see that we're triggering irrigation events. However, we look at a UF peanut farm, it missed 2 events, basically here and here, where the sensor's triggered. So what happened is it overestimated what this amount of rainfall did to that soil and how much it held. And then it also overestimated what these very small events here back to back did for our soil. We know in reality those small events really add no soil moisture back. So we've went in since and added some safeties to peanut farms, such as capping large irrigation events at approximately 1 inch. And we've also, if we have an event that's below 0.15 inches, we take and do not add that in to help account for issues such as that. So 2015, definitely a different year. We planted at about the same time, and you look, we harvested maybe about a week early, but approximately the same time there in October. Rainfall, however, is where we see a big difference in that year. 22.65 inches of rainfall in 2015. So again, my dry land yield is about 5,200 pounds. My highest yield in that year is 5,500 pounds. So there's no significant difference between yield in 2015. The good thing about that is that we're doing very good on dry land. The bad thing about that is if we're managing irrigation really intensely and we're irrigating a couple inches per week, is we've done ourselves no favor by adding an additional 12 inches of irrigation to that field. So my highest yielder in this case was actually USDA's Irrigator Pro, developed out of the peanut lab in Dawson, Georgia. It only irrigated 3 times that entire year. And so my point with this slide is, in a very wet year, it appears that there's, that the rainfall has kind of washed out the treatment differences. But are we going to go in as a producer and not turn my system on when it's relatively wet? Where do we make that decision that we don't irrigate? And so we need some sort of scheduling tool, whether it's a sensor in this case. This was a sensor coupled with an online scheduler, making a little bit more in-depth decisions. We need something else there besides just blindly irrigating or not irrigating at all to make sure that we kind of maximize our profit or maximize our irrigation applications. Hit it one more time. So in this case, of course, because it was the lowest application of water and the highest yield, Irrigator Pro came out on top. You don't see the separation this year between the dry land and Irrigator Pro as you did before. What you do see is that the dry land, we actually made more money than we did with the checkbook method than irrigating. And so when I poll a lot of our farmers in Georgia and ask them how they irrigate, typically it is X number of inches per week just throughout the entire season. So they're following this method, and so they think that they're, by being water conservative or over irrigating, that they're actually doing better than they would normally do in any other situation. And so when we start looking at data such as this, that you're actually losing money by adding that additional water to it, that tells you that that you're not doing the best that you could do better some other way. In this case, the separation really from our high to low treatment is about 1,050 down to 950. So, and I'm going to say only, but only $100 per acre difference, right? $100 per acre is pretty significant. So still, even in a wetter year where we see no differences really in yield, we have the opportunity to maximize profit if we implement some sort of sensor system or some sort of scheduling tool, independent of the cost of that. So let's look at 2015 really quick, the timings of the irrigations, and see that we had a much better, we did have some larger irrigation events throughout 2015. We see we had a lot of events that were over an inch, in the 1.5 to 2 inch range. But we had a lot of events that were in the half-inch range. It's kind of more well distributed. We don't see that dry period during 2015 that we did during 2014. So we see that our methods that are really following soil moisture pretty closely are following a soil water balance, are really backing off a lot on the irrigation triggers. And so we see from the method that I've developed, we've got about 5 applications. Again, Irrigator Pro with 3 applications. And then we can still see our checkbook though. Anytime that we don't have it in a particular week, our checkbook is going to irrigate. So I implemented a 50% checkbook this time to see if reducing that checkbook down by 50% actually helps. So that kind of gives you an idea of the distribution. And we'll look at finally 2016. During 2016, again, we had 25.8 inches of irrigation. So in this year, what I want to point out is that even though we had more irrigation or more rainfall, if you notice my irrigation numbers are higher. Why would that be? My yields are actually higher too, a little bit better year for producing peanuts.
Poorly distributed.
Huh?
Poorly distributed.
Right, so you saw the Tifton average and the Unadilla average rainfall events, you saw the average, and then you saw the single year event. What did it look like? We had a bunch of large events during 2016. So when I just look at this data and I don't think about distribution, somebody could say, well, why in the world was he even irrigating with 26 inches of rainfall during that year on peanuts? That's where we get questioned a lot, right, in humid areas in the U.S., especially from dry areas. They say, well, you get that much rainfall, that's more than you get all year, why do you need irrigation? So 1,000-pound difference in this year, that's what it came to. You can tell it was dry early. We ended up hitting 2 on that dry land, 2 events to get that crop up out of the ground to ensure we had a proper stand establishment. But then when we look within our irrigation treatments, we don't see a large separation again in differences. So if we look at profitability, you can hit it one more time. We don't see again the separation between the $6 and $9 per acre inch on cost of electric and cost of diesel. When we start looking through, there's only about a $30 profit difference between the 2 of those per acre. But when we start looking at implementing some sort of sensor-based system, even above the checkbook, we're still making a little bit of money off of that. So right, I cut this by 50% this particular year. My profitability is still above dry land and still above some of the other systems. It's significant. All right, we'll look at distribution. So again, just like we talked about, we had a lot of large events and then some very small events during the year. And so basically, they did not meet the water requirements because it was not distributed evenly and it did not do exactly what we needed to. So I think I'm about out of time. I'll hit, let's look at this in one other way. So I sat down with my economist. I've got about 4 more slides and we'll stop with those. So what he did is he went in and took this data and he applied from our budgets in Georgia, our enterprise budgets, some cost. And so you can look at it. He used $825 for an average irrigation cost, a little bit higher than what I was using. Well, he averaged across the years. He used weed control costs there, disease, and then he assumed all other input costs are constant. So, and he's not including opportunity costs of management. And he looked at the current market price. So let's look how the data falls out here. So here's 2014. And again, he's using dry land as a base. So this is what you could have, this is where you would have been. 2014 is going to look really good. The addition of irrigation looks great because we made no yield in 2014. Basically, we were at 0. And so you look at what that was, we're up in, $1,000 per acre profitability compared to our base. So let's look at a different dynamics that really tells a typical year. So this is where it gets scary. Where he's highlighted in green is where he was borderline profitable or in an acceptable range. He's broken it out by variety, so we planted 4 varieties there. All these are runner type variety. And so what we start seeing is we're actually losing money for irrigation compared to a base in a year like 2015. Not only I'm showing you just profitability, but he's looking at it back as a base. we've lost money. So in this case, this is when the decision really has to be made on variety selection, what variety is going to perform the best, and what irrigation scheduling method is going to perform the best. So in this case, it appears that one of the Florida varieties actually did best overall with Irrigator Pro. We don't plant many of these varieties in Georgia. Our most popular variety is 06G, a little bit of 12Y. So 06G, we would have lost money all across the board in that case. If we look at 12Y based on my base over irrigation, basically either the soil moisture sensor system, Irrigator Pro were basically my two most profitable. So if I look at my checkbook though, where I've applied all the irrigation, I'm losing about $160 per acre compared to my dry land, right? I've been better off again not to turn my system on. Stop with this one. So 2016, a very similar story. We see a little bit more profitability because we did have that 1,000-pound separation between the irrigated peanuts and the dryland peanuts. We actually made that 1,000 pounds more. The Irrigator Pro kind of came out on top, 12Y on the 06Gs, 12Y kind of right behind, and then we've got some of the tough runner varieties doing just as well. So with that, I'm just going to stop there for time's sake. I got a little bit more. You can keep going and hit the question slide. You got it. There we go. So with that, I'll take any questions from the audience about anything you saw at some of our methods.
You may have said it or may have not, I didn't catch it. What's the difference between your sensor SAA and your Irrigator Pro?
Okay, that's a very good question. I did not state that. So Irrigator Pro in this case is using watermark sensors.
Using what?
Watermark sensors, the Rometer brand watermarks.
Okay.
And so what it does is basically the way we did it, we manually entered the data on a daily basis. So if you can acquire that watermark data, via data logger or however it is, into Irrigator Pro, it estimates available water content of that soil, and it gives you days till irrigation. So depending on what that soil water tension rating is, it estimates how much moisture you have based on the maturity of that crop until you need to irrigate again.
So you're putting a lot of data into the computer, basically.
Right,
Okay.
and it's making the decision for you. On the SSA, I've set up a spreadsheet internally where I weight the sensor depths based on estimated maturity and root development. And I'm entering that in, and I'm hitting a target threshold of about 45 kilopascals on my soil water tension, which for our soils is about right. But if you get in a heavier soil, you can bump that up. If you get more sandy soil, you want to lower that.
But you have a physical sensor out there is what you have.
In both cases, I did.
Oh, in both cases. Okay.
And the SSA, I had a sensor out there also. Both of them are watermarks. It's just two different ways to interpret that watermark data.
You said when you're calculating your total water, rainfall, did anything over an inch, you capped that
At
at
1
1 inch?
Mhm.
Okay.
We did, and so we've also built that into some of our irrigation app suites. So we've developed a few apps out of University of Georgia. We've built that into those too, and the reason we've done that is in our soil type, and probably even more so in Mid-South, if we get an intent, and we're assuming it's too calculative, intensity, whatever everybody wants to say, to look at rainfall intensity every time, we can't do that. It takes too much calculation, processing power on that. So we had to make a dummy decision on if we receive this much rainfall in a particular day, where do we truncate it at? Of course, if we receive that inch rainfall over the 24-hour time period, or more than that, we know that most of it infiltrated. But if we receive that in a thunder shower, we know that a lot of it ran off. So again, we're losing some there, but we feel like we're better by making that upper and lower cap than just adding all the rainfall that goes to it.
Do these systems trigger the irrigation automatically, or do y'all, once you get the data, the farmer triggers the?
So we're working on that portion. A colleague of mine, Calvin Perry, is presenting this afternoon. If you look up him and actually Dr. Sweet that was here, if you look up, can't remember what session number his is, but it's the dynamic variable rate irrigation system. So what we're doing is taking sensor readings, determining an irrigation recommendation amount, and we're missing one link. He'll discuss that link, but basically from that amount, we're putting it into a pivot to do an application to the field. And so we're currently working with some of the pivot manufacturers now so that we can make that last connection. Right now, we're manually taking from our map and entering the data into their map and remotely download it, but that's just the programming step that we have to get agreements on.
What would you say the stage of the peanuts are when you first trigger typically?
When we first trigger irrigation, we're probably going to be on average 4 to 5 weeks in. If you go back to that water use curve, we see, right. We usually make sure we have soil moisture at emergence. As you noticed in all my graphs, we irrigated that. I think it's usually, depending on the year, 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch right when we planted them. Usually we're 3 to 4 weeks before we really start putting more water on them. We know that peanuts early, we don't want to, overwater them.
The sensors, I'm not familiar with what's out there now. Tried putting with tensiometers years ago, hated them. Tell me a little bit what you use.
And I know you're going to cover this some in your talk, right?
Okay, well, I'll wait.
So what we're using is in this case, is a watermark sensor, so it works just like a tensiometer. It measures soil water tension, but instead of having to worry about the ceramic cups, keeping it filled with water, air bubbles, air pockets, all that going dry, these are basically, you take a reading off them at any given time. And so you're able to, what we're doing is we're downloading hourly data. That's what this is, skipped. As we're able to graph this data out hourly, looking at the inverse soil water tension. Technically it's measured negatively, but just for aesthetics, we inverse it here. So as we go up, we dry, and we go down, we get back wet. So this is saturation of the soil here. This is what we would consider basically bone dry, no water at all in the soil. And so you can kind of see the wet and dry pattern of rain. This is a dry land trial, of course, no irrigation on the rainfall affecting that trial, and see kind of how the data starts to look. So I don't know if that fully answers your question. Maybe you want me to cover.
Well, I'll listen to his,
And then we can discuss it more fully.
if I have to, I'll grab it after.
Yeah.
Before you finish, is Irrigator Pro a software that actually
Right.
comes with the sensors? I mean,
No, so it is a free USDA software. If you search irrigatorpro.org, you can find that software. And it's also will work on soil temperature too. There's a way to do that. But it is a free software that you can download.
you mentioned a specific variety from Florida to show tremendous profit. Is there a tremendous cost of that peanut variety?
No, it's just that in that particular scenario, that variety happened to perform very well. Typically, due to industry, and my understanding, and I'm an engineer, so the agronomics kind of, I don't get as deep into them, but the industry drives what we end up planting in Georgia at least. They want a lot of those 6Gs due to seed size, due to taste, due to quality, all that, so that's why we end up planting mostly those. It's a little bit different in Florida, and of course I know it's different here in the Mid-South.
Those others are pretty new and they're not widely available.
Right, some of them are. It depends on which variety you're looking at.
And who you're selling to.
Well,
They're gonna say, we're gonna buy these.
Right. That's the word, yeah, that's what drives it, right, what they want bought. And so independent of that profitability, if you can't sell them,